You stand barefoot on cold marble. The perfume of jasmine still clings to the air, but its sweetness turns rancid as the heavy doors close behind you. The clatter you hear isn't your jewelry, it's your freedom, falling piece by piece as guards strip it away. Silk tears like paper, the same hands that once bowed to you now binding your wrists. The torchlight flickers, and in its glow you glimpse the reflection of a woman you no longer recognize, her crown gone, her hair unpinned, her name already fading from memory. From somewhere beyond the walls, a scream slices through the silence, a voice you know too well, your lover. The echo is swallowed by the rhythmic shuffle of eunuchs approaching, their whispers rehearsing what they call the test of fidelity. You understand then, this isn't judgment for treason, it's punishment for desire. Outside, the empire sleeps beneath golden domes and fluttering banners. Chroniclers will praise its order, poets, its beauty. But beneath this perfection, punishment was an art form, and you, once a queen, are about to become its masterpiece. If this glimpse into the forbidden corridors of power grips you, subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Every story like this was nearly buried, and your voice helps exhume it. Across centuries and continents, from the Ottoman harems of Istanbul to the Mughal zananas of Delhi, from the forbidden city of Beijing to the stone keeps of medieval Europe, one truth remained constant: a queen's heart was not her own. Love, for her, was political treason. These were not outbursts of jealousy by mad kings, they were systematic instruments of control, empires turning intimacy into surveillance and affection into evidence. The chronicles, the ledgers, the burial pits, they all agree on one thing: fidelity was enforced by fear, perfected by bureaucracy, and remembered only in whispers that survived the ash of palaces. The palace was never a home, it was an ecosystem of surveillance. Every glance, every silence, every misplaced breath was recorded by someone whose duty was to watch. The architecture itself conspired in the observation: latticed screens that allowed unseen eyes, echoing corridors where whispers traveled faster than footsteps, and chambers where the air seemed trained to remember confessions. The harem, the zanana, the royal quarters, different names, same function: containment of desire. In the Ottoman Empire, the Topkapi Palace rose as a citadel of discipline as much as beauty. The courtyards shimmered with fountains carved from alabaster, yet beneath them lay a labyrinth of passages connecting the sultan's chambers to the harem, designed not for freedom, but for control. Contemporary court documents describe ledgers tracking every concubine's origin, physical attributes, and temperament. One record from the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent lists over 400 women, catalogued with chilling precision. Age 17, Circassian, compliant. Age 19, Greek, spirited, requires restraint. There were no names, only values. Such systematic cataloging was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, it was governance. The women's bodies were investments, their loyalty, insurance. Historians have found receipts detailing replacement costs for concubines lost to illness or punishment, categorized alongside shipments of saffron and silk. To the empire, affection was an asset, and betrayal a financial liability. When suspicion of infidelity arose, the machinery of discipline engaged with terrifying efficiency. The accused queen or concubine was confined to a windowless chamber known euphemistically as the cafes, the cage. Officially, it was for reflection. In practice, it was psychological warfare. Days passed without speech, meals delivered through a slit in the wall, light measured in hours of obedience. The women within were made to feel that the empire itself was the judge, and silence its verdict. In Mughal India, the zanana followed similar principles cloaked in sanctity. Chroniclers at Emperor Akbar's court wrote with admiration of his systematic virtue enforcement. Behind that phrase lay a regime where royal women lived under layers of segregation. Eunuchs and trusted female guards monitored every movement. Letters from Jesuit envoys visiting the court describe a garden where no bird dares fly without sanction. When a rumor of intimacy surfaced, perhaps a servant's whisper or a misplaced gift, the accused would undergo the trial of purity. It began not with questions but with rituals, fasting, isolation, and symbolic cleansing with incense smoke said to reveal deceit. Those who fainted from exhaustion were declared guilty. The punishments were ritualized, almost theatrical. In Ottoman Istanbul, a guilty queen was often executed by strangulation with a silk cord, an act considered merciful, for it spared the spilling of royal blood. Yet the symbolism was cruelly intimate. The same silk that once adorned her now became her noose. In Ming China, condemned empresses were forced to swallow golden wine, a euphemism for poison laced with mercury. Chronicles recount that attendants were ordered to smile while administering it, to maintain harmony in her passing. In Europe, the theater of punishment was public, the scaffold, the axe, the roaring crowd. But in the East, punishment was a whisper, a ritual hidden behind curtains, where silence became complicity. Each culture wrapped its brutality in justification. Confucian scholars wrote that a faithless empress unbalances heaven's order. Islamic jurists called unfaithful concubines spoiled vessels. European clerics preached that an adulterous queen imperiled the soul of the realm. Across empires, the logic was identical. Female fidelity was not personal, it was national. A queen's body carried the legitimacy of bloodlines, treaties, and divine favor. To touch another man was to shake the pillars of heaven itself. But the systematic nature of these practices is what truly chills. In archives from Cairo to Beijing, scholars have found evidence of bureaucratic processes that managed suspicion as if it were taxation. One Ottoman ledger from 1627 tallies 17 cases of suspected infidelity, resolved, 9 by expulsion, 5 by transfer, 3 by silken correction. The numbers are recorded beside grain deliveries and naval expenditures. The implication is staggering. Punishment for love was not scandal, it was administration. For the women trapped in these gilded prisons, survival meant mastering invisibility. They learned to speak in coded gestures. A glance, a folded shawl, a dropped hairpin. Affection was encrypted, yet even silence could be treason. Chroniclers tell of concubines accused simply for smiling at musicians during festivals. One such woman, recorded only as the Cretan, was executed in 1589 after the chief eunuch testified that her laughter was too prolonged. Behind every execution stood an invisible economy. The harem's staff eunuchs, scribes, astrologers, profited from accusations. Rewards were granted for loyalty exposed, bonuses for betrayal proven. In the Mughal courts, astrologers gained favor by predicting which women would cause disharmony. These forecasts became self-fulfilling prophecies, as suspicion fell inevitably on those foretold. It was systematic psychological warfare, an empire feeding on paranoia. Even the dead were not spared erasure. Once executed, a queen's portrait was removed from palace galleries, her name struck from poetry, her lineage rewritten. In Ming records, entire genealogies were adjusted to exclude disgraced consorts, replaced with fictions that preserved imperial virtue. Archaeologists uncover tombs where inscriptions have been chiseled away, the stone faces of women literally scraped into oblivion. The process of dehumanization reached industrial proportions. Ledgers recorded pregnancies, miscarriages, and menstrual cycles with the same tone used for livestock yields. In the Ottoman court of Murad IV, surviving lists detail fertility intervals for concubines, data used to calculate optimal times for conception. Failure to conceive could mean reassignment to menial duties, or worse, disposal. Historians found marginal notes like non-compliant transfer to Baku. No explanation follows. The scale defies imagination. In just one generation, an empire could process tens of thousands of women through these palatial systems. Captured in war, sold by debt, or offered as tribute, they arrived as commodities of conquest. Contemporary chroniclers describe sorting grounds after military victories, where the young and beautiful were separated from the rest. 50,000 taken. One Ottoman source records of a Balkan campaign, 15,000 chosen for refinement. The rest, mothers, elderly, children, were sent to labor or left to die. It was systematic, efficient, and chillingly normalized. The empire's strength was measured not only in cannons or ships, but in control. Control of women's bodies, their emotions, their legacies. And behind the marble walls, behind the censored songs and perfumed curtains, every queen knew the truth. She was both ornament and warning. The more splendid the palace, the more suffocating its air. In those silken corridors, whispers could kill faster than swords. If you walked the courtyards of these empires in their golden ages, you would see perfection geometry and marble, fountains murmuring hymns to power, flowers arranged to mimic celestial constellations. Yet beneath that symmetry, the air was thick with unseen suffering. The same corridors that carried incense and poetry also carried orders of death, penned in the calm hand of a vizier. What made these punishments most horrifying wasn't their cruelty, it was their systematic design. They were crafted not in the heat of jealousy, but in the cold precision of policy. Betrayal was not judged by truth, but by necessity. When the sultan's or emperor's authority trembled, the surest way to restore it was through spectacle, a reminder that even a queen, beloved and crowned, was disposable. Court scribes noted every punishment with euphemistic detachment, reassigned to stillness, returned to the silence of God, removed for imbalance of fortune. Those phrases populate ledgers across centuries, their meaning identical. The woman had been executed, buried, or vanished. The language of bureaucracy made atrocity elegant. Archaeological excavations in Istanbul and Delhi have unearthed hidden chambers, small, airless rooms sealed with plaster. Inside, remnants of fabric, jewelry fragments, and occasionally human hair. Historians identify these as punishment cells, where accused women awaited their fate. There were no screams here because sound could not escape. Chroniclers say the guards were trained to hum softly as they passed the doors, to muffle any noise from within. Each empire had its signature cruelty, refined like an art form. The Ottomans favored the silken bowstring, a cord wrapped around the neck and pulled until the body went limp, quick, clean, and bloodless, preserving royal decorum. In Ming China, poison was preferred, its slow torment masked under ceremonial politeness. The Mughal emperors sometimes ordered confinement in mirrored chambers, forcing the condemned to watch herself fade into madness. In medieval Europe, adultery among queens could mean public execution heads, displayed as warnings that even crowns could not shield a woman's heart. But beneath the differences lay the same blueprint, a systematic network where love became evidence and affection a weapon. The mechanisms fed on suspicion, eunuchs intercepting letters, attendants spying during baths, astrologers whispering prophecies of betrayal. Over time, fear itself became the strongest instrument of control. Consider the case of Empress Chen of the Han Dynasty. Ancient records describe how she fell in love with a musician, an affair whispered through silk screens. When discovered, the emperor ordered her confined, her servants executed, and her name struck from the official histories. Her fate was written in a single line: the empress was unmade. For 2,000 years, her story survived only in folk songs. In the Mughal court, Jahangir's harem chronicler wrote of a woman sent to sleep beneath the black water. That phrase, poetic, vague, concealed horror. Historians interpret it as execution by drowning in the Yamuna River, wrapped in silk, weighed down with stones. It was not vengeance, it was ritual purification. Such acts served multiple functions: punishment, purification, and deterrence. They reminded every woman in the royal household that her body belonged first to the empire. The system thrived on complicity. Older concubines supervised younger ones, ensuring obedience through whispers of past fates. Eunuchs became both jailers and confidants, bound by the same fear. Some, over decades, grew numb, recording deaths in ledgers as routine as rations. And yet, there were rebellions. Small, desperate gestures that flickered like candlelight in the dark. In Ottoman lore, one concubine, Fatma the Georgian, is said to have carved her true lover's name inside her wrist with a gemstone, so it would enter the grave with her. In Mughal chronicles, a royal nurse smuggled a condemned girl out of Agra's zenana disguised as a corpse. No one ever found them. Such defiance was rare, but it existed, a whisper that humanity survived even in the empire's throat. Economically, fidelity became currency. The more pure the royal harem, the higher the prestige of the monarch. Taxes were levied to maintain these systems. Funds for eunuch guards, surveillance networks, ceremonial purifications. Entire bureaucracies thrived on policing women's virtue. The clerks and accountants of the forbidden wings recorded not passion, but productivity. 30 concubines maintained, 3 corrected, none deviated. Cold numbers masking living agony. Religious and philosophical justifications reinforced the machinery. In the Ottoman world, legal scholars cited Sharia interpretations that justified execution for dishonoring divine trust. In Confucian China, harmony of the household mirrored harmony of the state, thus a faithless empress endangered the cosmos itself. In medieval Europe, clerics invoked scripture. For she that defileth the bed of kings defileth the kingdom. The rhetoric sanctified cruelty. It turned torture into worship. There are chronicles that mention public displays meant to terrify without showing blood. In Persia, effigies of condemned queens were paraded through cities, faces veiled in black silk. Crowds watched in silence, knowing the real woman was already gone. The message was unmistakable. Love outside commandment was treason against heaven and throne alike. And through it all, the most haunting aspect was the calm repetition of it. Year after year, regime after regime, the same methods endured, refined, justified, archived. The historian Ibn Khaldun once wrote, "Power devours its own tenderness." He could have been describing every empire that transformed desire into crime. The trauma seeped beyond palace walls. Villages near royal cities lived in quiet terror of beauty. Mothers scarred their daughters' faces with ash or burns to keep them from being taken. Songs sung at weddings praised obedience, not affection. In folklore, love stories ended not in tragedy, but in caution. The lesson was simple: in a world ruled by suspicion, to love sincerely was to invite death. These practices were not accidents of culture. They were deliberate architectures of fear. Every rule, every ledger entry, every ritual of punishment served a single purpose: to preserve the illusion that the ruler was divine, that his household mirrored cosmic order. If chaos appeared inside those walls, if a queen loved another, the heavens themselves might seem fallible. And so the machinery ground on, fueled by paranoia, sanctified by ritual, until it became invisible, accepted, even revered. When modern historians examine these ledgers, they often note the handwriting, precise, steady, untroubled. The clerks who recorded human fates as inventory never saw themselves as executioners. They were civil servants, upholding the order of the world. That, perhaps, is the deepest horror of all, that the system's success lay in its normality. Pause and imagine a world where love itself was the most dangerous rebellion, where devotion could erase your name more thoroughly than treason, where the silken noose was not the punishment of monsters, but the policy of civilization. The echoes of those chambers still linger in stone corridors and forgotten poems. In the archives of Topkapi and the ruins of the Forbidden City, faint traces of erased names whisper through dust. Every empire built monuments to its glory, but buried beneath them, always, are the bones of its silence. If this history chills you as it does me, subscribe, and in the comments, tell me which empire's shadows you want to step into next. Because the deeper we dig, the more we realize. Civilization itself was founded not only on triumphs of power, but on the systematic control of desire. By now, the outlines of horror are clear, but what makes this darkness enduring isn't the violence itself. It's the machinery behind it, the way entire civilizations learned to operate cruelty as a science. The punishment of cheating queens was never just retribution. It was an algorithm of obedience, perfected across centuries. The empire didn't simply destroy the women who broke its code. It absorbed them, recycled their agony into law, religion, and economy. With every generation, the system evolved, more efficient, more invisible. Sultans died, dynasties fell, yet the bureaucracies of chastity survived them all. In Ottoman Istanbul, eunuchs who once strangled queens later became educators to their successors. The same hands that tightened the silken cords would cradle newborn heirs, whispering lullabies learned from women they had condemned. It was psychological warfare transformed into heritage. Eunuchs were rewarded with gold, titles, and power over trade routes. The empire's most loyal servants were those who had been mutilated by it, living proof that submission could be engineered. The machine of control fed on calculation. Scholars of the Abbasid and Safavid courts documented mathematical ratios for harem management, how many women could be kept, rotated, and tested without causing unrest. Records from Isfahan describe monthly evaluations, where senior attendants assessed behavior, speech, and demeanor. A single tremor in tone could spark suspicion. Excessive laughter indicates disquiet, one manual noted. Disquiet breeds deceit. And deceit, of course, meant death. But what chilled historians most wasn't the punishment, it was the normalization. The ledgers didn't scream of violence, they whispered of efficiency. 3 concubines were placed for breach of decorum, reads a Safavid record, in the same ink used to note olive shipments. The empire had learned to treat terror as accounting. Even the architecture obeyed. In the forbidden city of Beijing, imperial designers constructed whispering courtyards, spaces engineered to carry sound from the women's quarters to the guard stations. A single misplaced word could travel through stone. Every sigh became evidence. It was a systematic surveillance long before the age of cameras, an empire that heard everything and forgave nothing. The punishments themselves grew ritualized, sanctified. When an Ottoman queen was condemned, she was dressed in white silk, the color of purity, turned to irony. Her jewelry was removed and melted down to fund religious charities, converting scandal into piety. In Ming China, poison ceremonies were staged as offerings to harmony. In Europe, clerics blessed the executioners before swinging the axe. Faith was the lubricant that kept cruelty running smooth. And then there was the irony. The exquisite, monstrous irony that even as empires celebrated virtue, they commodified the very women they enslaved. In Mughal India, royal concubines were trained like diplomats, their conversations rehearsed for charm, their movements choreographed for devotion. But if one faltered, if her eyes lingered too long on another man, her disappearance would be explained as divine will. The ledgers would note it in cursive, harmony restored. Pause and consider what that means. A society so enthralled by its illusion of order that it forgot the cost of maintaining it. Every palace, every temple, every inscription of loyalty was built atop the silence of women buried nameless. Even the law reflected the paradox. Legal scholars debated the precise definition of adultery for royalty. Some declared that a queen could not sin, since her will was not her own. Others insisted that her soul, like her body, belonged to the ruler, and therefore could betray him spiritually. The debates never saved anyone. They merely legitimized the next execution. And so, across empires, the same truth endured. Punishment became performance, cruelty became scripture, and silence became civilization. The deeper one peers into these empires' archives, the more monstrous their elegance appears. What began as royal paranoia became an industrial theology, a belief system that equated obedience with holiness and desire with contagion. The punishment of cheating queens wasn't a reaction, it was a creed. Each empire encoded it differently, but the logic was identical. Power survives through the mutilation of intimacy. In the Ottoman records of the 17th century, an entry from the Grand Vizier's court describes a correction executed without disturbance. 3 witnesses in attendance, harmony maintained. No names, no tears, just protocol. The same script appears in Chinese Ming annals, noting that the inner court was cleansed. Across continents, identical words, cleansed. It was the euphemism that washed away guilt, both divine and administrative. As centuries turned, these systems refined themselves. The Mughal zananas evolved into micro-societies, each governed by hierarchy and fear. Senior concubines, the begums, were appointed as moral supervisors. They conducted nightly inspections, ensuring that no servant lingered too long by a lattice, no musician played unsanctioned melodies. The irony is unbearable. Women policing other women to prove their worth to men who never saw them as human. Yet for many, it was survival. To enforce the cruelty was to postpone it. And this is where the cycle reached perfection. The victims became the enforcers. A generation raised on terror replicated it as order. Eunuchs who strangled became mentors. Concubines who survived became judges. The empire fed on its own trauma, manufacturing obedience through inherited fear. In one Ottoman proverb preserved by travelers, it is said, "A quiet harem is proof of heaven's favor." But silence was never peace. It was the echo of countless throats stilled. The spectacle of punishment also evolved into entertainment, cloaked as morality. In some Mughal courts, poets were commissioned to compose verses about the fallen queens, framing their deaths as moral allegories. In Persia, miniature painters depicted the condemned queens as mythical temptresses, their beauty preserved in pigment, but their names erased. These artworks became collectibles among the elite, tokens of both lust and judgment. Even memory was monetized. One Jesuit envoy to Akbar's court wrote in a trembling hand, "They speak of justice as a garden, but I see only graves." His words echo across centuries because he understood what the rulers did not, that when a civilization measures its virtue by how quietly it kills its own, it is already dying. Pause and imagine the psychological landscape that remained. Entire societies structured around the idea that love could unmake empires. Children of condemned queens grew to fear affection itself. Daughters were taught that beauty was dangerous, sons that suspicion was strength. Thus, generation after generation, cruelty disguised itself as stability, passed down like inheritance. Even when the empires fell, the Ottomans crumbling, the Mughals fading, the dynasties of China shattering, the habits endured. The architecture of control was built into the culture itself. In modern villages across Asia, legends still warn of the queen's curse, where disobedient women vanish in storms or drown in rivers. Folklore preserves what history tried to erase. And so we arrive at the most chilling revelation. These punishments were not accidents of tyranny. They were mirrors. They reflected how every civilization, in its pursuit of order, finds a way to sanctify fear. The silken cords, the poisoned cups, the whispered decrees. They were not deviations from greatness. They were greatness, defined by power's ability to destroy tenderness and still call itself divine. When the chroniclers laid down their pens, they thought the record complete. But the true record is not ink. It is the silence that followed. The hush in the marble halls, the missing portraits, the erased names. The empire's final victory was convincing the world that such women never existed at all. History likes to remember its kings in marble and its queens in perfume. But what lingers longer than either is the silence. The kind left behind when a woman's name is erased from the stone she built, when her portrait is scraped away until even her eyes forget to exist. The punishment of cheating queens was never about lust or loyalty. It was about the empire's obsession with control. The body of a queen was the final frontier of conquest, and love, the one rebellion they could never fully extinguish. Empires crumble, palaces rot, the ledgers of obedience gather dust in forgotten archives. But the wounds remain, invisible and inherited. They echo in how societies still police desire, still equate purity with worth, still whisper that a woman's choices define the honor of her bloodline. The same logic that strangled queens in silk survives today, not in bowstrings and poison, but in shame, gossip, and law. Look closer at the architecture of any old capital. Those latticed windows, the narrow corridors, the courtyards that seem designed for listening, they were built to watch, to contain, to remind. Power has a long memory, and it disguises itself well. We like to think we've moved beyond such cruelty, but when affection still requires permission, when love still costs reputation, the old empire breathes through us. The chronicles remain, dusty, exact, merciless. They tell us that fidelity was not virtue, it was taxation. Desire was not sin, it was sedition. And yet, between the lines, one finds traces of the unrecorded. The handprint on a cell wall, the carved initials beneath a window ledge, the smuggled poem that survived because someone dared to remember. These small rebellions are the true counter-histories, proof that even within systems designed to erase, humanity insists on leaving a mark. Pause and think of what those women endured, not for what they did, but for what they felt. To them, love was a death sentence, but also a kind of freedom. They chose to feel in a world that punished feeling. That is defiance beyond courage. It is the essence of being human. If this history stirs something in you, subscribe and share in the comments where it struck deepest. Because remembrance is resistance. The ledgers of misery may endure, but so do we who choose to read them aloud. Together, we unearth the buried truths, we resurrect the erased, and we remind power that even in silence the condemned still speak.